certainly is a gap between where we are and where the Republican proposal that was.
Good afternoon, everyone. We will get started in just a minute. But in the meantime, as we are all beginning to gather in our Zoom presentation, I hope you'll take a look at our upcoming programs. We have quite an array coming up, and we hope that you will join us. To register, please visit mishjewishhistory.org/calendar. And if you've been enjoying our Zoom programming, we really hope that you will support us. In order to make a donation to help support our programming, please visit mishjewishhistory.org/donate. This afternoon, we are very honored to have with us Professor David Nasaw, who will be discussing his latest book, The Last Million, Europe's Displaced Persons from World War to Cold War. Now, before I begin my introduction of Professor Nasaw, I just want to remind everyone to please keep yourselves on mute throughout the presentation. And if you have any questions, there will be a question and answer session at the end of the presentation, and all questions can be submitted to me via the chat feature, and I will serve as moderator of our discussion. Now, as I said a minute ago, we are very lucky to have with us today Professor David Nasaw. He is a Pulitzer Prize finalist and lauded author. He is the recently retired Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr. Professor of History at the SUNY Graduate Center and has authored a number of award-winning and best-selling books, including, as the lecture title tells us, The Last Million, Europe's Displaced Persons from World War to Cold War. We are very excited to have him speaking to us today, and without further ado, please welcome Professor David Nasaw.
Thank you. Delighted to be here. I speak to you from a very snowy New York City. The sun is almost beginning to shine, but the snow hasn't stopped. I'm going to tell you a story that I spent 8 years researching and writing. It's a story that I didn't know, and I don't know if you knew. It's a story that as a historian, as a US historian, I should have known. And as an American Jew, I should have known. But I was under the mistaken impression, as so many of us were, that while the American government, President Roosevelt, did very little, nothing, to save the 6 million Jews who perished during the Shoah. I believed, again, it was just, I grew up believing that once the war was over, the sun would come out to shine, and the American government and people would open their hearts, their wallets, their doors to the Holocaust survivors. That was not to be. And that is the story I will tell of what happened. It is a story that's part of US history, world history, the history of World War II, Jewish history, and the history of Israel. What happened to the Holocaust survivors from 1945 to 1948, and for many of them to 1950. When World War II was over, there were 8 to 10 million refugees in Germany. There were French, Belgian, Soviet, Polish, Ukrainian, and Jewish POWs, political prisoners, camp inmates, forced laborers, slave laborers, and collaborators. Nazi collaborators who had ended the war on German soil. By early summer of 1945, all of the Western displaced persons, the Italians, the Soviets, the French, the Belgium, had gone home. But left behind in Germany were 1 million refugees, the last million, as they were called, and as I have entitled my book. Who were the last million? Who were these refugees who remained in Germany rather than go home? There were 2 reasons they remained in Germany. One, because they had no homes to return to, like the Jews. And 2, because for reasons I'll try to explain, they didn't want to go home again. The first group of refugees to enter Germany during the war were the Polish and the Ukrainians and other Eastern Europeans who were brought into Germany, who were virtually kidnapped and brought into Germany to do the work left behind by the German soldiers on the Eastern Front. Hitler had thought that the war would be over in a couple of weeks. The Soviets would give up, the Red Army would run. The British would say, okay, we give up too. But Hitler was very, very wrong. And as the war continued, he realized that in order to feed the soldiers and feed the home front and produce the uniforms and the armaments and keep the roads running, he had to replace the millions of soldiers who were on the Eastern Front. And he did that by bringing into Germany, again, by kidnapping, millions, literally millions of mostly young Polish and Ukrainian boys and girls, young men and women. And they were put to work as forced laborers and slave laborers in Germany, where they remained from 1940 and 41 until the end of the war. They comprised the largest group within the last million. The second group of refugees who were in Germany as the war ended were the Estonians, the Latvians, and the Lithuanians. And unlike the Poles, they only arrived in Germany at the end of the war. And why? Why? Some of them because they had lived under Soviet domination for a brief period before the war and didn't want to do it again. A large number because during the war they had cooperated in one way or the other with the Nazi occupiers. They had worked in the post office, or for the water department, or for the roads department, or for the auxiliary police. They had done the innocent work of civil servants, or they had done the brutal criminal work of the auxiliary police in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, and rounded up the Jews and brought them to the killing fields to be slaughtered. Thousands had joined Waffen-SS units and had fought alongside the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front. And they knew, these collaborators and war criminals, that once the Red Army returned, they would be punished for their collaboration in the crimes during the war. So at the end of the war, as the Red Army moved closer into Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and the Ukraine, thousands of refugees escaped to Germany, where they hoped they would be safe. The third group of displaced persons were the Holocaust survivors. As the war came to an end in late 1944, as Hitler and the German command realized that the Red Army was on its way, Hitler, Goebbels, Goering, Himmler decided that it would be best for the future that they hide the crimes they had committed against the Jewish people. And the Germans closed down the death camps, the labor camps, the work camps, the concentration camps in Poland. They burned them to the ground. They collected the corpses, the bodies of the dead, and they burned those as well. The remaining prisoners, large numbers of them Hungarians who had recently arrived at the camps, were put onto trucks, were put into railroad cattle cars, were marched, death marched, hundreds of miles into Germany so that they would not be captured and freed by the Red Army. And why did the Germans do this? Not to save any lives of the Jews, but because the decision had been made, rather than gas them to death, they would be worked to death in the underground mines, mills, factories, and armaments plants that Hitler had built to protect these plants from bombing raids and to produce the secret weapons that were going to end the war. Life in these underground factories was impossible. There was no air to breathe, little food to eat. The workers were worked 20 hours, 18 to 20 hours a day. And it was thought, what better way to use and use up the surviving Jews than to work them to death in these factories. When the war was over, when hostilities ceased, Hitler committed suicide. The American and the British armies marched into the camps. They liberated the inmates. And among those liberated were, we don't know exactly how many, 20 to 50,000 Jews who had survived. Interestingly enough, frighteningly enough, I discovered during my research that when the camps were opened up by Eisenhower to the press, to the German public, to English and American newsreel companies, to radio commentators, when the word got out about the concentration camps, about Dachau, Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen, there was no mention of the Jewish survivors. There was talk about the French prisoners of war who were in the concentration camp, and the Belgians, and some Soviets and Italians, some Poles, but nothing about the Jews. Nothing about the Jews. Edward R. Murrow's famous broadcast from Buchenwald, as he walked around Buchenwald and talked about the horrors he saw, he did not mention the Jews. And why? Because there were too few of them who would survive, because they were too frail, because they were next to death, and because most of them spoke only Yiddish. And neither Edward R. Murrow, nor the American, nor the British journalists or politicians who visited the camps spoke Yiddish. It was only a small number of Jewish chaplains who were assigned to the army and who entered the camps to liberate them, who discovered there, looked for and discovered the Jews. When the camps were liberated, the Americans and the British assembled the survivors along with the other refugees in Germany, the Polish laborers, the Baltic and Ukrainian refugees. And they sorted them out by nationality and they put them into displaced persons camps to care for them until they could be sent home. There was no recognition that the Jews were a separate people who had suffered disproportionately to everybody else. If you were a Polish Jew, you were put in camps with non-Jewish Poles. If you were a Lithuanian, you were put in camps with non-Jewish Lithuanians, which meant that many of the Jews found themselves in the same displaced persons camps as men who had been their guards in the camps, or men who had participated in rounding them up for the killing fields, or watched over them in the ghettos. The Jewish chaplains complained bitterly about this to anyone who would listen. And they wrote home and they wrote to their congregations and they wrote to their congressmen. And word finally got to Washington and to Robert Morgenthau, who was the Secretary of the Treasury, the only Jewish cabinet member under Roosevelt and now under Truman. And Truman and the State Department decided that they needed to investigate what was going on with the Jews. And they sent a law professor from the University of Pennsylvania who had been raised a Presbyterian. He now went to Quaker meetings. He was not a Zionist. He was not a Jew. He was never belonged to any Jewish or Zionist organization. They sent him to investigate. And he came back to the White House with a report he had written. And Truman, and he has to be, celebrated for this. Truman, instead of just waving Harrison off or sending him to some subordinate, sat down with Harrison and he received his report and he read his report and he talked to Harrison. And what Harrison had said in his report was that we, the American military, the American government, are treating the Jews just as the Germans had. We're putting them into camps. The only difference is we're not exterminating them. And Harrison said to Truman, the only place that these Jews will feel safe is in Palestine. And Truman immediately, at the Potsdam meeting in late July, he said to Churchill, and then when Churchill was replaced by Clement Attlee as prime minister, he said to Clement Attlee, you have to open the gates of Palestine to the Jewish displaced persons. And then he said further, as Harrison had written in his report, the British don't have to worry about the Middle East being overrun by European Jews because 6 million or no more. We're not talking about millions, we're talking about a couple 100,000. And Truman made his case and he made it over and over and over again over the next couple of years. And the British said, no, we will not open the gates of Palestine to the Jews until the Arabs say it's okay. And the Arabs were never going to say it's okay. Beginning in the summer of 1945, the displaced persons who were Jewish because of what Harrison had said and what Truman directed Eisenhower to do, the Jews were placed in their own camps in Germany. In the beginning, through the end of 1945, the Jewish displaced persons in those camps numbered maybe 40, 50,000. Why? Because many of the Jews who had survived Dachau and Bergen-Belsen and Buchenwald, as soon as they were freed, liberated by the American soldiers, the first thing they did, those who could walk, the first thing they did was to find a way home to Vilna, to Lodz, to their hometowns, to see if anyone had survived. And they did not return to Germany and to the camps until 1946. I'll explain why in a minute. The largest number of surviving Jews, Polish Jews and Lithuanian Jews, were those who had crossed the border into the Soviet Union and thereby escaped the Nazi death machines, the gas chambers and the killing fields. They did not have an easy time. They spent the war years in Asiatic Soviet Union, in Kazakhstan and Tajikistan, working at hard labor, but they survived. And when the war was over, Stalin said to the Jewish community in the Soviet Union, those of you who want to return to Poland can do so. And Stalin provided them in 1946 with railroad cars to transport them back into Poland. 200 to 250,000, mostly Polish Jews, made the return trip to Poland. And when they arrived, they discovered that there was no place for them in Poland. They returned to their businesses, their shops, their homes, their apartments, their farms. And they were told by the Poles who now lived there, we thought you were dead. You have no place here. Poland is now for Poles only. And through late 1945 and 1946 into 1946, there was anti-Semitic violence against the Jews, waged not by Nazis, but by Poles. There were militias that tried to exterminate the Jews, I'm sorry. There were pogroms, including a dreadful pogrom in Kilcha in the summer of 1946. And the Jews who had survived the war recognized that the only safe place for them in Europe was in the displaced persons camps in Germany, behind barbed wire, guarded by American soldiers. What a tragic irony that the only safe place for the Jews was in Germany. And they gathered their belongings. They paid bribes. They were escorted sometimes by ex-soldiers from the Jewish Agency, Jewish soldiers from Palestine who had fought with the British in Italy, and by Jewish Zionist activists from Bricah, B-R-I-C-H-A-H, and 150 to 200,000 Polish Jews made their way across borders through Czechoslovakia and Austria into the displaced persons camps in Germany. Life in the camps was not easy, and it was not easy for anybody. It was not easy for the Lithuanians in their camps, or the Poles in their camps, or the Jews in their camps. The Poles and the Lithuanians and the Latvians who refused to go home hoped that someday the Americans and the British would start World War III and would push the Soviets out of Poland and Latvia and Ukraine, and they could go home again. And they prepared for that homecoming. They taught their children Polish history or Ukrainian history, kept the language alive, taught local customs, had choruses and orchestras and singing groups. The Jews had no home to go back to, but they had a homeland to dream of in Palestine. And in the Jewish camps, the survivors of Hitler vowed to one another that they would rebuild the Jewish community. They would not let Hitler win. They mourned the dead, but they knew it was a luxury to mourn, to dwell in the past. And they began to build for a new Jewish community, hopefully in Palestine. By the beginning of the post-war period, there was an international debate over what to do with the last million. The Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc of nations said, and there was a logic behind this, they said that every displaced person who is not a Jew should be sent home immediately. And those who do not want to go home for one or two reasons. Either they're too damn lazy and they'd rather be fed and sheltered in camps than rebuild Poland or the Ukraine or Lithuania after the war, or they were collaborators and refused to go home because they knew they'd be punished if they did so. So while the Soviets demanded that everyone be repatriated, the Americans and British said, no, we're not going to force anybody to go home. It is our responsibility to take care of these people, to feed them, to shelter them, until they can decide whether they want to go home. And if not, it is our responsibility to find somewhere in the world to resettle them. And in late 1946, 1947, the British and the Americans, over the objections of the Soviets and the Soviet bloc, formed the International Refugee Organization, IRO. And IRO, beginning in late 1946, 1947, began to notify the nations of the world who would join the IRO that they could send delegations into the displaced persons camps to pick and choose those they wanted to resettle in their countries. The Canadians needed railroad workers and forestry workers and farmers. The Brazilians needed farmers. The Argentinians needed farmers and they needed miners. The Belgians and the English needed miners and nurses and domestic workers and agricultural workers. And each nation sent its teams and they went through the displaced persons camps and they picked and chose. They said, we'll take you and you and you and you, not you. Their first choice was always the Latvians. Why? Because they had not suffered during the war. They didn't have typhus, or they weren't frail, they weren't weakened. They had only come at the end of the war. And they were white, European, and Christian. Second choice were the Lithuanians, then came the Ukrainians and the Poles. Nobody wanted the Jews. Nobody. By 1947, 2 years after the war had ended, tens of thousands of non-Jewish displaced persons were settled in nations across the world, resettled, told that if they worked hard for 3 to 5 years, they could bring their families and they could get citizenship. No nation welcomed the Jews. Why? Because they were considered to be clannish, adverse to hard manual labor, thieves, and probably Bolshevik subversives. You know, there is no such thing as anti-Semitism. There are anti-Semitisms. This hatred and fear and rage against the Jews takes different forms at different moments in time. After the Bolshevik Revolution, the Pope had blamed the Jews, said the Jews were responsible. Hitler had taken up that same message and had said that one of the reasons the Jews had to be exterminated was that they were subversives, revolutionaries. And when the war was over, that same theme spread like wildfire through the West. And it reached into the United States. The United States of America was the last nation on earth to open its doors to any displaced persons, Jewish or non-Jewish. It was not until June of 1948, 3 years after the cessation of hostilities in Europe, that the United States of America, that Congress passed and Truman signed into law a Displaced Persons Act that provided visas for more than 200,000 displaced persons. But guess what? That law was written in large part by Southern Democrats, Midwestern Republicans, and their allies. And the provisions of that law privileged the giving of visas to former citizens of lands that had been annexed by a foreign power. Latvians, Lithuanians, Estonians, Ukrainians. And it explicitly barred the granting of visas to any displaced persons who had not been in Germany on December 22nd, 1945. 90% of the Jewish survivors had entered after that date. Why? As I said, because they had gone home to Poland to look for loved ones. They had fought with the partisans. They had been in hiding. They had lived in the Soviet Union. And they did not enter the camps until 1946. The law was so discriminatory against Jews that Truman, at first, he didn't know what to do. And he signed the bill, but he said it was a disgrace to the American people because it discriminated against the Jews in the way that it did. It was not until 1950 that that bill was amended. But by the time it was amended, the Jews in the displaced persons camps, rather than wait and hope and pray that America would open its doors and change the 1948 bill, with the independence of the state of Israel, they left the camps for the one place on earth that welcomed them. of the 200 to 250,000 displaced Jews, more than 150,000 end up in Germany. I'm sorry, end up going from Germany to Israel. Large numbers, 25% of the casualties in the 1948 war were displaced persons. Only about 55,000 of the 250,000 end up with visas to the United States. That in itself is a crime, and that's a part of our history we should understand. But there's another part as well. Historians have written about the Jewish displaced persons and the Polish displaced persons and post-war Germany and post-war the United States, but they haven't put together, as I was able to do, a comprehensive view of all the displaced persons of the last million. And when you do that, you understand that in the United States, in England, in Belgium, in Brazil, in Canada, in Australia, there were more Nazi collaborators welcomed and resettled than there were Jewish survivors. In Great Britain, hundreds of Latvian men were welcomed because there was a labor shortage. And a large number of them were put to work in the mines. When the British coal miners saw that the displaced persons they were working with had Waffen-SS tattoos on their arms, on their armpits, they refused to go back to work. The Home Secretary and the Foreign Secretary met in London to decide what to do. And the decision was made to keep accepting former Waffen-SS division members from Latvia and Estonia and the Ukraine into Britain, but never again to put them in jobs where they'd have to take off their shirts so others could find out. In Australia, the Jewish community sent spies into the halls and the dormitories where the displaced persons had been assembled and listened to the talk in which they talked about their experiences during the war and reported back to the Australian ministry that we have war criminals here, we have collaborators here. And nothing was done. And why? Why? It was not simply anti-Semitism that the Jews were kept out. It was because almost immediately following the Second World War, the nations of the world entered a Cold War. And for Americans especially, but for others as well, we have a very short historical memory. And remembrances of Hitler's atrocities and Nazi atrocities were quickly put aside. That was the past, forget about it. Past is over. Hitler was defeated, the Nazis were defeated. We now have to worry about the Soviets. And we now have to worry about the Reds and spies. And therefore, we can't let the Jews in because they might be spies, but we can welcome the Latvians because even though they might have collaborated with the Nazis, they're fervent anti-communists. And they're going to help us in the US of A in the event that the Cold War turns into a hot war. It was not until the middle 1970s that Congresswoman Elizabeth Holtzman, a Jewish congresswoman from Brooklyn, who replaced Emanuel Seller, another Jewish congressman, that someone leaked to Liz Holtzman the fact that the INS, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, had a list somewhere of dozens of war criminals who had been led into the country as displaced persons. And the INS had this list, but it did nothing about it. And that Liz Holtzman couldn't believe that that was true because, again, she was a Brooklyn Jew. She knew all about the Holocaust and all about World War II. And couldn't believe that that had happened and never heard anything about this. So at a routine hearing, she confronted the head of the INS and she said to him, you know, is this true? She expected he'd say, no, that's ridiculous. He said, yes, it's true. And as a result of that and her intense lobbying, a special division was set up within the Justice Department to find these Nazi collaborators and war criminals and deport them. And once the Americans began this effort, the Australians and the Canadians and the British did as well. But by that time, these war criminals and collaborators, men like John Demjanjuk and Bishop Valerian Trifa of Michigan, and Karl Linus from Estonia, and Yakiv Palij from the Ukraine, who was only extradited in 2018. They had lived in America for 30 years. They had covered their tracks. Very few of them were deported, and only a handful brought to justice. Let me end my story with a note of redemption. I want to salute and to celebrate the survivors, the displaced persons, who refused to capitulate, who in the camps gathered information about war criminals, information that was later used to identify and extradite those war criminals. They did this in 1945, 1946, 1947, 1948. Simon Wiesenthal was only one of hundreds of ex-displaced persons who did everything they could to indict the war criminals and the anti-Semites who had participated in the slaughter. So I want to salute them, and I want to tell the story of Itzik Lachman, who I met in a nursing home in Queens, New York, as I was completing my book. And Itzik and Lola had met when they were teenagers, or had gazed at one another lovingly, as they remembered it, at a seaside resort in Poland before the war. And both of them had been in several camps during the war. And because they were strong, they survived. And they ended up the war in Dachau and then were sent to Landsberg, which was a camp for displaced Jews. And Itzik wanted nothing more than the opportunity to work with his hands again. He was a locksmith and a carpenter. And he went to the camp supervisors and he said, what can I do? And they said, well, you know, we need someone to put together bunk beds in the girls' dormitory, in the women's dormitory. And he went into the dormitory, and while he was hammering together the bunk beds, he saw Lola in the background. They were married. They had children in the camps. And very early in their courtship, when they were just at Landsberg, a Jewish chaplain came up to Itzik and he said, Itzik, do you have any relatives anywhere who we can tell that you're still alive? And he said, yeah, I have cousins, I think in Brooklyn. And the Jewish chaplain put a little notice in all the Yiddish newspapers in New York, including the forward. And Itzhak's cousins found him and wrote to him. And for the next 3 to 4 years, did everything they could to get him to the United States. And he and Lola and their son eventually came to the United States in 1950. And Itzhak looked at me at the end of his interview. His wife Lola didn't speak because she had lost a twin at Dachau and never spoke about the war. And Itzhak looked at me and he said, I've been married to the woman I love for 70 years. I have children, I have grandchildren. He said, my cousin saved me and America saved me. And he looked again, straight in the eyes, and he said, it's a good life. It's a good life. I thank you and would be happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Nasaw. We did have a question that has already come in over the chat. And again, please submit your questions via the chat feature, and I'm happy to moderate this portion. The first question that came through is, how many Jews left the DP camps and went to Israel?
155,000 went legally, and another 20 to 30,000 illegally on ships like the Exodus. Most of them who went on what was called the illegal aliyah or aliyah bet to Israel, before there was an Israel, to Palestine. The British met them at Haifa, which was the only port they could land at, unloaded them from their ships and sent them to Cyprus, where they spent the next couple of years in camps in Cyprus. It was only when independence was declared that they were permitted back into Israel, or they were permitted to go to Israel. So maybe a total of 200,000 displaced persons end up there. And they don't have an easy time of it. They don't have an easy time of it. The Israelis accept them, but don't quite know what to do with them. Israel is a country at war, and the displaced persons are, for the most part, need an extraordinary amount of love, care, and support.
Another question that came through is, now that you are retired, what are your future scholarly plans?
Oh, well, I just finished this book and I'm doing a lot of Zoom chats. It's almost as if having discovered this story and told this story, and living in these difficult COVID environment and lockdowns, I want to get the story out there. So I am doing as many Zoom events as I possibly can. And I'm beginning a new book on the post-war period and the stories we don't know. I mean, we talk about World War II as the good war, and the soldiers who came back as the greatest generation. And I want to tell the story of the veterans who came back to the United States destroyed by what they had seen and what they had experienced. And I want to talk not about the smiles and the cheers and the parades, but about the alcoholism, about the trauma, about the neuroses, about the horrible times the Jewish veterans had. The Black veterans, there were more lynchings after the war than before the war. The gay veterans who couldn't go home again. So that's my next project.
On a different note, another viewer asks, why did the UK Labour government turn on Jews who, if communists, were also fellow socialists?
Yeah, it's a great question, because it's a very good question. The Labor government had supported the Jews and the Balfour Declaration and a homeland as long as they were out of government. When they took over the government, they changed their mind entirely. Why? Because the only way they believed to sustain the remnants of British power in the British Empire was to stay friendly with the Arabs. So the Arabs were much more important to them than the Jews. And if they had to sacrifice some Jewish lives by keeping them in Europe, that was fine, as long as the Arabs were their allies and they had access to Arab oil.
Is it true that there were more babies born in the DP camps than anywhere else in the world?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know who asked that question. Absolutely. What happens is, in the beginning, when the camps are first opened, the 20 to 50,000 who had come out of Dachau and Bergen-Belsen and into the camps, they were old. There were no children. There were no young people. And then beginning in 1946, the Polish Jews begin to come into the camps and everything changes. There are more baby carriages. There are more births. The birth rate in the camps goes way up. Why? Well, there are a variety of reasons. But one of those reasons is this need to resurrect a Jewish community. And how do you do that? By making more Jews. There are remarkable stories, some in my book and some in other books, of what goes on in the camps. One of the things that the Jews do is they refuse to be married because the only way they can get official marriage licenses is through the Germans. And they say, no, we're not going to let any Germans sanctify our marriage. So a lot of these marriages are paper marriages until they get to the United States or Israel, and then they formalize them. Yes, it is true that the birth rate in the camps was greater than anywhere else in the world.
Were there German Jews in the DP camps?
It's a good question. Yes, not very many of them. Most of the German Jews who had survived the Holocaust, in a variety of ways, they preferred to live outside the camps in their own apartments or their own dwellings or their own towns. There was an enormous debate among the German Jews about whether to attempt to resurrect a German Jewish community or to leave. Most of them left in the end, but they were categorized as displaced persons, and they got help from the United Nations and the Americans. But for the most part, they lived outside the camps.
Do you have any information that you could give us on the DP camps in Torino, Italy, and any resources that the person asking the question can look to?
Sure. The person asking the question should contact me at dnasaw, D-N-A-S-A-W, at gc.cuny.edu. And if you forget that, I'm sure there are other ways to find me. Yes, there are camps through Italy, and there are camps in Austria. I told the story of mostly of the camps in Germany because 80% of the displaced persons are in Germany. But the camps in Italy are mostly for Polish Jews and Romanian Jews and Eastern European Jews and Hungarian Jews who escaped to Italy. A lot escaped to Italy because they figure it's closer, it's easier to get to Palestine from Italy. Others because the Italians had been better than the other Europeans in regard to the Jews. I mean, the Italian Jews were slaughtered, but many more survived because the Italian people refused to swallow whole Nazi anti-Semitism.
What about the French Jews? What happened to them?
It's again, it's not a very pretty picture. The French Jews, the Vichy and the Vichy government and the French cooperated with the Nazis in rounding up Jews, putting them into concentration camps in France, especially Drancy, D-R-A-N-C-Y. And then when the Germans said, we want them to be sent to Auschwitz, the French police and the French government said, okay, we'll let them go. When the war was over, the French Jews that had survived returned to France, and the French government paid them no heed, paid them no attention whatsoever. The French government was much more interested in the so-called resistors, in the political prisoners, than it was in the Jews. And it got to the point where the French government erected monuments to the survivors of Nazi terror. And they downplayed the Jews entirely. And the Jews, French Jews, set up their own commissions, their own memorials, their own libraries, and their own archives to tell the story of the French Jews. It was not until a former professor of mine at Columbia, a man named Robert Paxton, an American, rewrites the history of Vichy France and of France during World War II and tells the French people about the ways in which they had collaborated with the Germans in the slaughter of the Jews. But, you know, I have an uneasy feeling. We all love Paris and France, but I still have an uneasy feeling because the French have not recognized, in the same way as the Germans have, their complicity in the murder of the Jews.
Do you think that that's led to some of the issues that both countries have with anti-Semitism today?
God, I don't know. I wouldn't know how to answer that. I think that the French, you know, I've never thought about it before, but I think whoever's asked that question is correct. I'm going to correct myself now. Yeah, I think because the French government has never recognized the existence of anti-Semitism. I mean, it talks about the Dreyfus Affair, and it talks about some of the anti-Semitic slurs about Leon Blum, but it doesn't recognize the deep-rooted anti-Semitism that's been part of French culture, I think. And because it doesn't recognize that, it has not been able to recognize the persistence and the recent flare-ups of anti-Semitism in the 21st century.
What about the Austrian Jews?
You know, the Austrian Jews there weren't very many of them. I mean, the Austrian Jews were decimated. And when the war was over, the Austrian response was rather dreadful. The Austrians, instead of the Austrian government, the Austrian people, the Austrian press, the Austrian intellectuals, instead of admitting to and atoning for their partnership with the Nazi murder regime, claimed that they had been victims. They claimed that Hitler had taken over Austria, which was not true in any way. I mean, we learned much too late that Kurt Waldheim, an Austrian, had been a Nazi collaborator, as were many other Austrians. The Austrians still have a lot to atone for, I think, because of their lack of recognition of their identification as Germans with Hitler and with the Nazis.
You and I had discussed this briefly before everyone signed on for your presentation. Why do you think it is that for my generation, things are kind of glossed over into the Jews were liberated and everybody lived happily ever after wherever they chose to settle type of narrative?
Yeah. You know, when the Jewish displaced persons finally arrived in this country, they were quiet. They had suffered so much that all they wanted to do was to be able to live in peace. Some talked to their children about what they had been through. Many others remained quiet, which was different. When the war was over, the displaced persons wanted to tell the world what had happened to them. And the world didn't listen. So 5 years later, when they finally came to the United States, they recognized for their own sanity, it was better to just keep quiet. I think that's one of the reasons. The other reason is that the story is just too dreadful, too un-American. You know, if you're like me, you love America and you're proud to be an American. And you don't want to go looking in the crevices. Now we're beginning to do that. We're beginning to recognize, you know, that there are, you know, we too, as a people, have committed crimes against humanity. We've done things we shouldn't have done. I wish I knew more. You know, it was a shock to me when I began to do this research and I interviewed the few remaining Holocaust survivors I could find and the children. And I would always ask, when did you get to this country? And they all said 1949, 1950. And I said to them, well, didn't you wonder? Didn't you think? Didn't you ask questions about what went on for that 5 years? And some of them did, but they learned very little from their parents. Their parents didn't want to talk about it. It was an extension of the war for them. The war was not simply a 5-year war or a 4-year war. It was a decade of displacement. First by the Nazis, and then in Germany in the displaced persons camps.
Another viewer has asked, what about the Netherlands Jews? What happened with their situation?
The Netherlands was, you know, the Dutch were, I don't know how to describe it. The Dutch did very little to protect their Jews, much less than the Italians, and certainly much less than the Scandinavians. And when the war was over, for a variety of reasons, the Dutch were wary about publicizing the fate of the Dutch Jews who they had allowed to be sent into Germany and exterminated. The Dutch suffered dreadfully during the war. Dreadfully during the war. They considered themselves victims, and they were victims. And as such, they were less open, I think, to recognizing that they were not only victims, but they had victimized or done less than they could have to protect their Jews.
What is it about the culture of certain countries that led some countries to protect their Jews and others did not?
Oh my God. What a great question. There have been, dozens and dozens of books written on this. And we don't know what the answers are. I don't know what the answers are. How bizarre is it when one looks back that the nation in which the Jews were most fully assimilated, Germany, was the nation that resorted to genocide. I don't quite know. I know what happens in Poland. What happens in Poland after the war, the anti-Semitism after the war, is that Poland had been destroyed by the war, by the Germans and by the Russians and by the fighting. And the Poles had succumbed to the Nazi propaganda, and they didn't want to give up the little that they had that had been taken from the Jews. I don't know what it is. I don't know why. I mean, the Hungarian government, for example, which was a fascist government, refused to cooperate with Hitler in killing its Jews. Hitler had to take over Hungary in order to exterminate the Jews. The Italians refused. The French, handed the Jews over. A large number, in the beginning, it handed over all the Jewish refugees who would come from Germany or from Poland into France. And then it said, take the French Jews as well. I wish I had an answer to the question, but if whoever asked the question sends me a note, I'll give you some books to read that do better than I can.
Would you be okay if we sent out your email to those here so that
Oh, sure, absolutely.
contact you for more information they can?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Great. Are there any other questions? If so, please submit them via the chat. We'll wait a few minutes to see if any more come through.
I've gotten, one of the joys of writing this book is that I have gotten dozens of letters from all over the country and from Australia and Canada and England, from people, from the children of displaced persons who said, thank you, David, because you filled in the blanks. I never understood this or this or this or this or this, and now I know. I just got yesterday an astounding letter from a Ukrainian man, not a Jew, a Ukrainian who wrote me, and he said, thank you. And then he told me the story of his family, how his mother, and he wanted more information from me, and I'm getting it for him. They were in a camp, a Ukrainian displaced persons camp near Hamburg, and his mother had an episode of terror. He doesn't know why. And she was sent to a German hospital. And when she came back from the German hospital, she was, more of a lunatic than she had been before. And she would never talk about what happened to her. And he wanted to know why she was sent to the German hospital, and did I know how to find out what might have happened to her. But then he told me the story, and he understood it after reading my book. He said, when we tried to come to the United States, we were denied visas because my mother had been in a mental institution. And the Americans weren't going to let in anybody who had a history of madness. And he said it was only because of a Jewish doctor who wrote a special letter saying my mother was okay now that we were let into the country. They came to the country, and 6 months later, they got a note from this Jewish doctor. And he said to them, I found a job in Wichita Falls, Kansas. And I see you live in Kansas City, Kansas. Can I come stay with you until I find my footing? And this Ukrainian family said yes. And they welcomed the Jewish doctor. He stayed with them for a couple of days and then spent the rest of his life in Wichita Falls. So this person wanted to find out more from me, had found out a lot, but wanted to find out more. So, you know, I'm happy to fill in the blanks.
We did have another question that just came through. I wonder about the paucity of information about life in the DP camps in memoirs, novels, and films. I'm not a scholar, so not familiar with the research.
There's a lot of, I welcome whoever asked the question to look at bibliography of my book, where I've got all the memoirs. You know, this was, there are some subjects that haven't been written about because there's not enough material. This was not one of those. There was scores of material. I found material on life in the displaced persons camps, on the political debates between East and West about what to do with the displaced persons, about the congressional debate about what to do with them. I found memoirs, oral histories, testimonies from the displaced persons in the United States, in London, in Germany, and of course in Israel. Steven Spielberg put together the Shoah Project, and he collected tens of thousands of testimonies from Holocaust survivors. And many of them tell about what happens after liberation. And they tell the stories of life in the displaced persons camps, which I've told in my book. Steven Spielberg, you know, has contacted us about doing a film following up on his earlier work. And it would use information from my book and also from his Shoah Project. There are oral histories that have been collected in Yale, by any number of Jewish institutions, in Germany, in Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and in Israel. So there's lots of stuff out there. And much of it I talk about in my bibliography and in my book.
Well, I haven't seen any more questions come in on the chat. So I think that we will be closing our presentation today. Thank you again, Professor Nasaw. I think I speak for, I just saw a question come in. What impact did Pope John the 23rd have on Europe after the Vatican Council's call to end the teaching of anti-Semitism in the Catholic Church?
Boy, that's a great question. Yes, he had an impact, but not a great one. Anti-Semitism in Poland was just too deeply embedded. You know, the Poles have recently passed a law in which if you're a Pole and you accuse or you say that the Poles were in any way complicit in the Holocaust, you go to jail. The Poles, certainly this present government, refuses to accept the anti-Semitic violence that happens before, during, and especially after the war. I think Pope John recognized what he had to do. And it was a shame that he had to do it, that it took until his regime for the papacy to clear the Jews of a crime that had never been committed. So we should both celebrate Pope John and continue to, condemn the Catholic Church for its role in spreading anti-Semitic death, spreading anti-Semitic myths, and contributing to the death of the Jews.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Nasaw. I've included Professor Nasaw's email in the chat, and we'll also send out a separate email to all of you who attended today with his contact information, so you can feel free to get in touch and learn more about this topic. Again, thank you very much, Professor Nasaw. We are very appreciative to have you with us today. This was a really wonderful, wonderful educational talk. And we hope you all will join us again very, very soon for one of our upcoming Zoom programs. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Bye now.